Chapter: A Feast of Some Significance. Calumny and his new general with the thin mustache had just finished exploding a canister on top of a metal hatch discovered in one of the gnome residences, and were mulling what to do next. The explosion had done nothing to the metal, superficial scratches. One of the miners, trying to prove his worth and practical how-to, was nosing round the hatch door, saying there must be some way to open it. A secret knob or a hole you could stick a key into. If they could find the hole, he could open the door. These things weren't complicated once you knew what you were looking for. Twisting a hidden latch. If you were clever, you could make anything twist. The latch could look like anything. He got on his hands and knees and rapped his knuckles randomly against the ground. Calumny listened to this blabber, the look on his face, conveniently curious. Calumny's whole personality might be summed up in such a phrase. Curious if it was convenient for him to be. Curious if it was obvious there would be something in it for him. What had made him curious about Popheme? She made her worth obvious. As their group stood by, debating the next move, a knock came at the door. A voice yelled down to Calumny, saying they'd captured more prisoners. Calumny was dismissive and yelled back to put them with the rest, and the miner hesitated. He walked down to speak to Calumny. He said these had surrendered from the slope and wanted to talk with him. One was a lady elf, the miner said in a forceful whisper. Calumny acquiesced and ascended, ready to think about anything else anyhow. Outside, Spliff and Miniwoona were waiting for Calumny. He focused his attention on the gnome, who was looking at him with dignified determination. "Thank you for seeing me," Spliff began. "I would really like to address everyone simultaneously, if it can be arranged. I have a proposition from our gnomes, but it would require cooperation." There was something about the gnome's demeanor, a sparkle in his eye, a confidence that Calumny recalled well after his first accident with the Atheromite, when everything in the world seemed clear. How many moments did one see the world clearly? The fine details of motivations, the fine details of everything. At a glance, he'd seen the detail in the grain in the wood boards of the inn. Being reminded of this confidence almost made Calumny jealous. Almost because he could squash the gnome's moppy head in 2 stomps, and for such creatures one can never be truly jealous. Calumny stood for a long while, saying nothing. Then he asked about the deal, what was being offered. "Like I said, if we could have some type of gathering." Spliff moved his hands towards each other. Calumny had a thought. He walked them through the doors of the house and down to the metal hatch. "You show me how to open this up, and then we'll have a dinner." Spliff responded, saying he didn't know how to do that. "Who are you if you don't know how to open one of these?" Spliff had to acknowledge it as a valid question, and because he wasn't going to allow himself to be a liar, a paradise wouldn't need liars, Spliff took a deep breath and gave the background for who he was. This took some time, and Spliff spared no details. Miniwoona was both a bit concerned and fascinated hearing the whole story laid out like this, for a killer who wasn't going to appreciate any nuances. Still, Calumny let the gnome finish entirely. "So you're saying you've never been down one of these holes?" Spliff laughed. "Right, exactly." "And you're going to get them to open up the gate?" "Yes, I think I can," Spliff said. "Well, go back and do it then. Tell them we won't hurt no gnomes. They surrender, they can have back their prisoners." "What prisoners?" Spliff asked naively. "In the house next door." "How many?" Min chimed in. "I don't know." Calumny didn't want to give away the fact they only had 12, but then he remembered the 2 he interrogated in the marketplace. "One of them said he was you. Said he invented the crystals." Spliff asked if there was a female gnome with him. Calumny confirmed, and Spliff asked if he could see them. "You keep asking for things," Calumny commented, "without offering much in return." Your life? Happiness? Are these not worthy things? Spliff asked. The naive confidence was now getting on Calumny's nerves. Miniwuna could tell, and she was nervous. So, a few words from you, and everyone is going to live in peace and harmony, Calumny said, the words dripping with sarcasm. You see, this whole situation is my fault, Spliff said, and Min was starting to wonder why she had indulged this grandiosity. I'm not saying everything will be perfect, but any map without paradise isn't worth looking at. That includes you. You were lied to. So, you mean to sacrifice yourself, Calumny growled. If need be, Spliff said sincerely. The stupidity was now amusing to Calumny. Fine. If the little guy wanted to get torn to shreds, it'd be good sport for the troops. I think you're right. You should talk to everybody. We'll let the men decide. And Spliff was the exact same level of calm and happy. It's exactly what he wanted in the first place. Spliff had been both disappointed and relieved to find the female gnome with Keppo was not his sister. He was allowed by the human rebels to enter the temporary prison and invite them both to join him for dinner. Keppo did not feel like he could refuse, though he wanted to resist. He wanted to question how, like always, Spliff managed to waltz around catching no shit from anybody. It seemed to Keppo he was always getting mistreated by some gnome, and now the humans, like his wife who ignored him, or the other counselors who didn't take him seriously, or even Potentia who had rushed him out of their hiding place to become prisoners. Walking up the street and back to the glass house, Keppo did not like the look in the human's eyes. He'd seen those eyes his first day in the mines right before ritual hazing. The humans knew things he did not about what was going to happen, and it was impossible those things were good. Entering the mansion, Calumny began barking orders. Miniwuna quietly sidestepped next to the female gnome and said it was nice to meet her. Potentia looked up confused at the elf, trying also to hide distaste and scorn because all the stories she'd heard about elves were of disgusting orgies and muddy rituals. She'd even heard the elves put their dead and their feces in the same place and used both to grow the hallucinogenic herbs for their orgies. She hid this disgust well, partially because confusion was her primary feeling. Min picked up on the confusion and whispered her brother had talked about her. Potentia stated matter-of-factly she didn't have any brothers. Then they were both confused, but didn't have long to awkwardly wonder before Calumny, with his ingrained sexism, ordered them both into the kitchen and helped prepare the food. And don't cast any witchery over it either, Calumny sneered at Min. Unless your spit tastes like sugar, then feel free. Until this very moment, Calumny had never considered being attracted to or sleeping with an elf. Sucking the spit out of her mouth, a deep debauchery was rising within him, a lust for power and to have anything he wanted immediately. He would go and get Popheme himself, maybe have a quick rut to sober up. He told his new general to take over, get everyone assembled at the feast table. It would also look dignified, arriving last with his new queen. He'd make everyone stand when he entered. Calumny smiled to himself at the thought. The rebel miners stood close guard to Keppo and Spliff and followed orders marching the two gnomes up the steps to the feast table. Finally, Keppo found his courage and asked Spliff what was happening. He spoke in Yomish, trying, poorly, to hide the desperation in his words. Spliff asked about his sister. Keppo said she was fine and in frustration growled, "What are you doing?" Spliff ignored his brother-in-law and continued ascending the steps. He asked again, Keppo was sure she was fine? "Well, I don't think any of us are fine," Keppo grumbled. "It will be okay." The phrase, in Yomish, coming out of Spliff's mouth, a banal platitude to Keppo's ears, like, "Tomorrow is a new day." "Oh, really? Is it? How very helpful." Keppo was almost shaking with anger, or was it fear? He had a hard time differentiating, but kept telling himself it was anger because he could focus on anger. Anger had a goal, an enemy, in a way fear didn't. Everyone was his enemy. In the kitchen there were already several humans mucking around with food. Miniwuna and Potentia stood awkwardly in the entry before one of the humans called them over. In a surprisingly quiet voice, he asked them what was happening. Potentia shrugged, and Min spoke for them. She said there was to be a dinner. They were to help. There was a queer sort of look on the human's face. His nostrils kept puckering as if holding back a smile. Then he winked at her. Min cocked her head and looked closely. She didn't understand. He asked her a question. Is the dinner celebrating anything in particular? Perhaps one of the old kings, Francis II? It took Miniwuna a moment, and then her eyes widened. Francis looked away, pretending to do something with the food. So? He asked more harshly. Min tried to give nothing more earnest away in her tone when she said a gnome envoy had come to the house. He wanted to address all the humans. Francis gruffly told the two women to take over whatever they're doing, pointing at two miners who looked none too happy to stop peeling potatoes. Francis went over to the men and said he'd take it from here. Go sit and enjoy some wine. After he walked the men out, Francis turned around to face the kitchen and smiled. Potentia peeked around the corner of the big table, very suspicious about what was happening. 2. Old Man Iondine finished winding the crank and released the small handle which began to turn, sending out the secret knock. An old clacking mechanism designed to warn members of the three families and a signal to meet. He was pleased the old gears turned. It had been decades since it was last used. Reliable gnome engineering. The fluttering of paddles could be heard behind the walls as he walked through the hall as quickly as he could with his cane. His two daughters already waiting for him outside the pantry. "Father," Connexia said, addressing him with the most formal word Yomish had to offer, "please stay here." "Really, we must insist," Alenza chipped in. "Dad, you can't. This climb." Counselor Iondine waved them off with his cane. His small and thin frame snuck between them like a leaf between branches. He walked into the pantry and put his hand on the second rung of the ladder. He held out his cane to his oldest daughter, who took it with an eye roll. The old gnome put both hands on the third rung, and lifting his second foot onto the bottom rung and reaching for the next bar, he realized his arms did not have the strength. He tried holding on, thinking his will would return, but Alenza put her hand on his shoulder, and he released his grip back into her control. The three of them turned to see Haida in the hall with her three children, baby folded in her arms, and she spoke affectionately to the old man. "Stay here. You can help me with the children." Connexia gave Haida a rare, kind look. The two daughters swung thin swords in cloth scabbards, glorified sporting swords, onto their backs and began ascending the ladder. In the narrow enclosed alley they waited. Connexia took some initiative and removed wood planks from the two other openings. Alenza, who wouldn't have been out here for any reason except seeing with her own eyes Potentia being escorted into the glass house through their spyglass in the study, was already nervous and ready to drop this whole endeavor. "We cannot take them all on. I hate to point out the obvious," she said. "Well, if you hated it, you wouldn't have done it, would you?" Connexia countered, dropping the last plank with a thud. The first covering to crank open, after their own, revealed the Delhine brothers. The younger ascended and stood and held down his hand for his middle-aged brother, who held down a hand for a female gnome, and finally an adolescent gnome climbed up quickly, not needing a hand, looking excited. They all greeted each other in a formal and awkward way. The history between Connexia and the eldest Delhine was as dry as rock dust. In their youth they had been set up for an arranged union, but they didn't like each other, both too spoiled and set in their ways for any melding. It lacked a heat of necessity, but today Connexia had a goal she couldn't accomplish on her own, and so she put on her most pleasant complexion. She explained what they had seen and asked if their family had seen the same. The youngest chirped up he had. He'd been glued to their spyglass. The female gnome, the younger brother's wife, introduced the adolescent as her son, and the third hatch started cranking open. Counselor Hyop slowly revealed his chubby face. He was a bachelor who accrued servants like purchased friendships. He called back down below for some gnome to push, and he pulled a rope with him as he finished climbing. At the top, he asked for help, and Connexia and the male gnomes grabbed a large sack, which clanged metallically set on the hard gravel. The adolescent's eyes lit up as the sack was unbound to reveal a bounty of different weapons. The lad was drawn to them, and Hyop quickly took to explaining the weapons' different pedigrees and tactical advantages. "And this one is named Fire-Torn. I purchased it from a traveler from the east who said back home they sculpt reinforced notches near the hilt here, which is meant to catch your opponent's blade, and..." Connexia had enough. "Counselor, if you don't mind, we called this meeting because I think we can do something very practical. We've surveyed the scene, and there's only 2 human guards in front of the house where they were keeping our sister." "How did she get captured?" the eldest Delhine asked. "She ran away with her idiot." "Why?" "That's a different question," Olenza answered scornfully. Connexia was attempting to keep the group together and on task. "We all have many questions, and the way I mean to answer them is in that house. They aren't going to see us coming. Thank you, by the way, Counselor, for the weapons." Her practiced political tone won over Hyop, who needed to think of himself as very dignified. The political tone also put a halt to the conversation potential, and all stood by as if in preparation for something very formal. Connexia sighed internally. She was going to have to spell out every action. "So, arm yourselves and let us dispatch these 2 guards. The freed prisoners we can send down to the slope and inquire why more backup hasn't arrived." "Because the gate is shut," Hyop stated. "What?" Connexia was confused. "Perhaps because you did not leave your house during our counterattack, you did not hear the plan," the elder Delhine said coldly. "But we're ready to leave now. I don't think I really understood what they were saying," the female Delhine said, touching her face nervously. Her husband said he'd felt like he didn't understand either. "But we are with you," the elder Delhine, doing his best attempt at solidarity. "If we have the chance to do something, we should." Slowly they all picked up different weapons. Olenza pushed out the small brick door, and all stooped through. In the street there was less enthusiasm. "They'll see us coming," a Delhine pointed out. "What if we make a distraction?" the adolescent chipped in. Hyop concurred. This was a solid military tactic. "I think we should head to the gate while we can," the mother whispered with appropriate conservatism. All agreed, and Connexia was also supportive, but hadn't they all just now said the gate was shut? As they walked through the empty streets, they gained paranoid confidence. The adolescent was walking quite frivolously and kicked a loose and broken piece of clay that scratched along the roadway and clattered into other pottery. All turned to him, and he stood up straight. They made it to the gate without further incident. Connexia led the way. She was first to stick her face between the impromptu metal shielding. Although they were in shadow, she could see 6 gnome figures standing nearby, and one noticed her quickly. She couldn't help but joke, "What if it had been the humans sneaking up on him?" The gnome guard looked unmoved and responded the humans would never be so quiet. Connexia gave the news that the humans had gone inside the glass house, so it would be safe to open the gate. The other gnomes in the dome crowded around her in a quiet chorus, echoing her words. The other guards approached the gate, and their lack of enthusiasm made Connexia nervous. The miners and craftsmen scanned with suspicion these rich gnomes. "We are under strict orders, no one enters." The mother Delhine elbowed Connexia out of the way, getting closer. "We didn't understand how long it would be. You're under no threat. At least let my son through." She turned and reached for the adolescent who stood his own ground. "Really, ma'am," one guard said in mocking formality, "we can't break these rules." "Could be spies," another said. The mother cried, "Of course they were not spies." Her partner did not move, so his older brother came and put a hand on her shoulder, trying to notate that hysteria would do no good. A gnome with a tall axe finally said, "Maybe if you had Master Spliff with you." The rich gnomes looked around at each other. "Who?" The guard gave a brief explanation of Spliff having entered to talk peace, and the mother arguing back if they could open the gate for him, why not open for them, and the guard saying this was not the same thing, and so the group turned to each other for conference. Connexia said she was still in favor of freeing the other gnomes. Olenza said in the meantime she'd thought up a plan. She'd walk casually around the corner to where the humans could see her, act surprised, and run backwards into a trap where the rest of the gnomes would be waiting, weapons at the ready. The group waited, blades drawn. Olenza jogged around the corner and through the gnomes where she picked up her thin blade. She was soon followed by a human who stopped dead in his tracks with wide eyes. The adolescent and his uncle dashed forward, hacking at the man's shins, and he fell. The other human turned the corner, ready to take a swing at the gnomes who were stabbing his friend at angles in his belly, but then stopped and ran, seeing the rest of the gnomes waiting. Connexia and Hyop quickly gave chase. Connexia stabbed him in the flanks with her long sword, but the man ran on, and so Hyop drew from his belt a piece of rope weighted at both ends. He'd never practiced against a moving target, but his concentration stayed. He flung the weighted rope, which hit perfectly at the ankles, and the man fell hard onto his belly. Connexia stabbed into the man's back, and her sister soon followed, skewering him to the ground. Although it took a minute for him to die, which dampened the mood somewhat, breathless groans have a habit of dampening enthusiasm, the group was still quite pleased with themselves. After the human breathed his last, the sisters withdrew their swords, and with raised eyebrows and new confidence, they threw off the board securing the door and entered the residence to free the prisoners. After 10 minutes of communal good feeling, Olenza approached her sister. Now what? Connexia was filled with confidence. I think we go take a look. Those who joined the rebels were brought back to the pile of arms, and those who did not have the energy or courage descended back underground, still grateful to their rescuers. 12 strong, they approached the door to the glass house. 3. Francis took the last dish off the dumbwaiter and flicked the release with his elbow, which sent the tray down and the mechanism quietly clicking. He'd saved this last dish of smashed potatoes to place near Spliff, putting the 4 previous heaping piles in front of other goons around the horseshoe table, which were eagerly dug into. He'd tried to catch Spliff's eye, but his friend seemed to be completely lost in thought. As he set the last dish in front of Spliff, Francis leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Eat light." Spliff turned his head at this strange pair of words. The human was already walking away, but now Spliff could smell, lingering behind, a faint wisp of pine needles and Francis's distinct body odor he'd spent so many days sat next to on the carriage. He turned back to the potatoes, which had already been stolen away from in front of him. Another plan was afoot. Spliff wasn't sure how to feel about this, though it made him steel his internal resolution to make sure his words were best. Francis had seasoned the food with a variety of depressants, thistle tonic and a decoction which used fruit acidity to break down seed pods of wild mustards. These were hidden in the potatoes and primarily would enhance the sensation of the wine, but the true star of the show were to be his roasted vegetables, which he'd mixed with oil of hemp flour. Depressants paired well with oils. Depressants were themselves like the brain's oil, the juice of feeling squeezed down into pure feeling. Francis had already had a small serving of both dishes, just to make sure he hadn't overdone anything, and to feel where everyone else would be at, a little ahead of time. Francis had tuned his mind, with time and tonics, so he was aware of emotions a second or two before they ripened. This was a hard-learned practice of Druidism, this tiny division between the acknowledgement of the feeling and the feeling itself. The entire universe might become clear in such a division, but whatever clarity this gave was not useful in the pragmatic sense. It was only to recognize that one's emotions were not truly who one was. At the head of the table, Popheme sat next to Calumny, who was nearly scowling. He'd been unable to get Popheme to have sex with him. She'd been able to placate him by saying she needed to be stimulated seeing him act as a gentleman first. Only then could she be turned on by the idea of rutting with him like an animal. It was unclear to Popheme if she'd ever used this line before. It felt like she had, but wasn't that often the case with a clever turn of phrase? It always felt like one had used it before or heard it somewhere. Miniwuna pulled the squeaking dumbwaiter rope hand over hand, and Potentia helped serve the last dishes of food when they arrived. Soon after, she returned to her place against the railing, along with other humans who couldn't get a seat at the table. Potentia both wanted to hold and kiss Keppo and slap him in the face. But seeing as he was forced to stand right by Calumny, she could do neither. He looked pathetic from her position now, stewing in his regrets. Potentia even let herself, just a little, blame Keppo for this whole thing. If he hadn't been in her house, forcing her to try and look more serious. And wasn't this whole situation his fault? Faking being an inventor? She felt angry with him. Spliff scraped the bottom of a wood bowl which had held mashed potatoes, wrapped a few roast vegetables in flatbread, enough energy to propel himself through the speech, and maybe a glass of wine. The wine was flowing freely. A barrel taken from the market had been hoisted up the dumbwaiter. The men dunked pitchers in at will. The mood was jovial, with an undercurrent of weirdness. One tone off from the chord you were expecting. Enough lethargy the men who didn't have seats at the table were making places for themselves to sit on the floor. Spliff stood on his chair and climbed onto the table. As soon as he was vertical, and his mouth opening to speak, Bragadine took the final step into the dining room and caught everyone's attention. Bragadine raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. He walked over to the table looking for food. Spliff chose to continue, undeterred. Fellow miners, you have now breathed the air of the dome. Does it taste as sweet as you imagined? Perhaps the air is even a bit worse than the pure air outside. It's true you were brought here by a lie you had no part in crafting. The lie made you slaves to it, and frankly, I am one gnome who does not hold this rebellion against you. And there are others as well. We understand your frustrations. Spliff gathered his thoughts and began again. When I first discovered a thermite, the ore you've been digging for, it scared me. It frightened me what would occur if it fell into the wrong hands, and so I ran away. For 10 years I tried to erase my fear from my mind, and it worked. Because coming back here, seeing what has become, my worst fears have been realized, and it's not that bad. There's been death, but you were mistreated. For what? For a crystal? For a little light to sit and read by or drink wine with friends? Things can be for us. The things don't have to use us. You didn't see the fruits of your labor, and that was wrong. I could blame that man, Spliff pointed at the impostor Falcior, who was meekly standing and eating his bread and veg. But the things do so often control us. We get jealous, want the things to work only for me, and will kill for the things. That man, again he pointed at Falcior, that man did not set those parameters within our hearts. He merely took advantage of them. And frankly, so is your leader now. Spliff waved gently at Calumny, who stared the gnome down with glazed hyperfixation. Spliff was really in it now. The only option was to persist in the point, finding reason in the beyond. Why can't we stop once we start? Why not give up the fight and come to a deal? Us gnomes can be reasonable, and like humans, we need the truth. Once they hear your side of things, the whole truth, we can come to an arrangement. What would you do, even if you won? Spliff realized he had no more to say after this question. He let it hang in the air. Slowly all eyes turned towards Calumny. Yes, you have words, little gnome. Although agitated, Calumny was not angry, surprisingly. Words like the wizard had when he convinced everyone to do things his way. But make no mistake, he looked around the table. Words do not change anything. The only thing that matters in life is when the blade is drawn, whose throat is being cut. If you aren't the cutter, it's your throat. Calumny drank down his glass of wine. And as for what we will do when we win, well, there's no other choice. There's victory or death, and we plan to win. Many human voices cheered in chorus, but not nearly all. Be reasonable, Spliff pleaded, turning to Calumny directly. You are outnumbered, 50-1. What you are proposing is a war on mice. Do you mean to kill every mouse in the world? You will live better lives if we come to an agreement. If you release the prisoners and go, we can give you riches from the mines. Start your own city or buy one, without having to look over your shoulder. Many of the humans, feeling broad in scope in their own consciousness, were interested in this and made little sounds of approval. Popheme rose suddenly. I think you all should hear the wisdom in these words. You have few advantages left. Calumny stood and grabbed Popheme by the throat. It is not your place to say, woman. As the tension rose, Bragadine barked. Hey, you! He was looking towards the stairs. At the top of the landing, an adolescent gnome stood, looking frightened. He immediately turned and started running down the stairs. Bragadine gave chase. Calumny finally boiled with rage. You see, he screamed, these little rats will never respect us. Humans bolted out of their chairs like racing dogs after a rabbit. Miniwoona looked down at the blowhorn still hanging from her neck, and she put it to her lips and blew hard, not really sure why. She then ran up to the table and with remarkable strength grabbed Spliff under his arms. She brought him over to the dumbwaiter and flipped the lever, and he began descending in confusion and with protest. A clatter of sounds and cries could be heard from the stairs, and more humans jogged after, and Francis stood still, like an aside in a squall. He looked at Popheme, and then up into the light coming from the dome, and thought to himself, sometimes, when the sun is at the right angle, one can see inside their own head. Little dancing stars, all the mind really is. And he almost became a sparrow, and flew away.